My brother told me I was not invited to his Hamptons wedding inside the $2.5 million glass house I had bought for him. He laughed and said, "It's only for real family." So while he stood before 250 guests promising his bride a life of wealth, I completed the sale. Then a sheriff walked in and handed him the document that ended the ceremony. Before I explain how that wedding collapsed in front of Sterling's new in-laws, I need to tell you how my own family taught me that generosity without boundaries becomes permission to exploit you. My brother Sterling stood right in the center of the grand foyer, swirling a heavy crystal glass of 25-year-old scotch. The golden amber liquid caught the bright light of the massive, custom-built chandelier hanging 20 feet above our heads. I paid for that chandelier. I remember the exact day the general contractor handed me the invoice for it, $40,000. I wrote the check without blinking an eye, thinking I was finally building a permanent, beautiful legacy for my family. I paid for the imported Italian marble floor beneath our feet, the kind of stone that feels freezing cold even in the middle of summer. I paid for the scotch currently resting in his glass. I paid for the literal roof over his head. But he didn't even look at me when he delivered the news. He just laughed. It was that hollow, practiced, Upper East Side chuckle he had spent the last 5 years perfecting in front of his bathroom mirror. He took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the expensive liquor warm his throat, and then he finally looked me dead in the eye. He told me the guest list for the wedding was officially finalized, and my name was not on it. I stood there, frozen, trying to process the sheer audacity of what he had just said. 250 people were coming to this glass-walled masterpiece in the Hamptons. 200 strangers, wealthy socialites, local politicians, and arrogant business partners from his fiancée's side of the family. But there was not a single chair for the person who actually bought the property. He leaned in close to me. He smelled of expensive mint cologne and sheer, unfiltered arrogance. He whispered that it was a strict, family-only event. Apparently, I was not family enough to rub elbows with the Pemberton family. He actually looked at me, a cruel smirk playing on the corner of his lips, and said my presence would embarrass him. He claimed my working-class hustle, the way I clawed my way up from nothing to a massive corporate salary, would taint the blood purity of the high society union he was so desperately trying to join. He honestly thought he was standing at the absolute peak of a mountain he had climbed all by himself. He forgot I was the one who hauled the rocks, paved the dirt, and built the damn mountain for him to stand on. I didn't scream. My chest tightened so hard I could barely pull air into my lungs, but I didn't beg for an explanation. I already knew the answer. I just stood there in the echoing, cavernous foyer of the house that cost me $2.5 million of my own hard-earned money, and I felt nothing. No, that is a lie. I felt a cold, sharp, terrifying clarity wash over my entire body. I looked down at my watch. It was exactly 4:17 in the afternoon. Sterling thought he was playing a brilliant, flawless game of social standing. He thought he could just discard me like an old, expired receipt now that he had found a much richer, more prestigious family to latch onto. But he had brought a plastic butter knife to a gunfight with a professional, cutthroat real estate negotiator. I looked at his smug, perfectly tanned face one last time. I didn't say a single word. I turned around, my heavy leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble I owned, and walked out the heavy oak front doors. The crisp, salty ocean breeze hit my face the second I stepped outside, and right then, my heart hardened against him. I pulled my phone out of my pocket before I even reached the driver's side of my car. They thought I was a fool who would quietly accept the disrespect because I always had in the past. They were about to learn exactly how I afforded a multi-million-dollar property in the first place, and I was going to make sure the lesson destroyed them. To truly understand how we ended up in that massive foyer staring each other down, you have to understand exactly where we started. I remember the day of my mother's funeral 17 years ago like it happened this morning. I was only 14 years old. I stood in the thick, freezing mud of the cemetery under a heavy, oppressive gray sky that smelled of relentless rain and wilted white lilies. I was shivering violently in a cheap, ill-fitting black suit I had borrowed from a neighbor. My father, Conrad, the respected and feared local judge, did not hold my hand. He did not look at me to see if I was okay, or if I needed a shoulder to cry on. Instead, he put his heavy arm around 16-year-old Sterling, pulled him close under the large black umbrella, and whispered to him. I heard him say that Sterling was the man of the house now. I was standing just 3 feet away, freezing to the bone, water dripping down my neck, and my father looked right through me like I was made of invisible glass. That afternoon, back at our quiet, mournful house, Conrad walked into the kitchen and handed Sterling the keys to my mother's vintage Porsche. It was her absolute pride and joy. She had spent years saving up for it and meticulously restoring it. She always told me she wanted me to have it when I got my driver's license because I was the one who was out there in the driveway, helping her wash and wax it every single Sunday afternoon. Conrad tossed the heavy silver keys to my brother without a second thought. He turned to me and coldly stated that I could walk to school from now on because Sterling needed the car to maintain his important social life. I walked 2 miles in the freezing, pouring rain the very next day while they drove past me, splashing dirty water onto the sidewalk without even tapping the brakes. That was the exact day I realized my family was not a circle of love, warmth, and support. It was a pyramid. Conrad and Sterling sat comfortably at the absolute top, and I was just the wide, silent base they intended to trample on to keep themselves elevated. Things only got significantly worse a year later when my stepmother, Lenora, moved into the house. She was an absolute master of subtle, daily cruelty. If Sterling wanted a brand new electric guitar, he got it the next day without question. If I needed new running shoes for high school track practice because my toes were literally poking through the worn-out fabric, Lenora would dramatically sigh, look at Conrad, and say money was tight right now. She constantly whispered in Conrad's ear, ensuring any spare dime went directly to Sterling's future. When it was time for university, they secretly drained what was supposed to be my college fund to send Sterling on a luxurious, 3-month summer backpacking trip across Europe. I ended up working brutal, exhausting night shifts at a greasy 24-hour diner just to pay for my own used textbooks at a local community college. Every time I achieved something massive, like landing a huge promotion at my first commercial real estate firm or securing a 6-figure salary, they ignored it. They only cared about Sterling's minor, fabricated successes. I spent my entire youth trying to earn a single genuine nod of approval from Conrad. I bought that massive Hamptons house years later thinking it would finally make them respect me. I thought providing for them and giving them luxury would prove my worth as a son. I was an absolute fool to think I could buy love from people who were fundamentally bankrupt of it. Fast forward to just a few weeks before the anticipated Pemberton wedding. I was sitting alone in my corner office in the city, working late on a Friday night to close a difficult, high-stakes commercial lease. The city lights outside my massive window were bright and chaotic, but the glow of my computer monitor cast a harsh, lonely blue light across my empty mahogany desk. On a sudden whim, driven by morbid curiosity, I decided to check out Sterling's official wedding website. He had been bragging about it for months to his new high society friends. The website was overly flashy, plastered everywhere with the Pemberton family crest, elegant gold cursive fonts, and staged, professional engagement photos taken on a private yacht. I scrolled down the page and clicked on the gallery section titled, Growing Up. I wanted to see if he had included any pictures of us as kids, maybe a nod to the past before everything went toxic. What I saw on that high-definition screen made my blood run cold. There were dozens of photos from our childhood carefully arranged in a grid. Family vacations to the lake house, Christmas mornings surrounded by torn wrapping paper, high school graduations, and summer barbecues. But I was not in a single one of them. I leaned much closer to my monitor, my eyes narrowing as I inspected the pixels. In a picture of Sterling and Conrad standing proudly by the Christmas tree, there was a weird, fuzzy blur near the edge of the frame. He had explicitly used an artificial intelligence editing tool to scrub me out of every single photograph. Where I used to stand holding a brightly wrapped present, there was just a digitally generated, awkwardly placed piece of living room furniture. In another photo from a summer cookout, he actually went out of his way to edit in some generic, stock photo distant cousin to make the family look larger and more refined for his wealthy bride. He did not just casually exclude me from a party. He committed deliberate, calculated digital murder on my entire childhood existence. I was furious. My hands shook so badly I could barely pick up my cell phone from the desk. I desperately needed to vent to someone who understood the twisted dynamics of my crazy family. I called Griffin. Griffin had been my closest friend since high school. He knew exactly how my father and brother treated me behind closed doors. I paced around my large office, venting about the website, about the sheer, undeniable disrespect of erasing me from my own life story. I told Griffin the first was angry, that I was done playing the quiet, nice guy, and that I was going to financially cut them off for good. Griffin sounded so remarkably sympathetic on the phone. He told me to stay calm, take a deep breath, and not do anything rash that I would regret. I thanked him, feeling a little better just getting the poison out of my system. I did not know that the absolute second Griffin hung up the phone with me, he immediately called my father. Griffin had recently started a struggling tech business and was desperately trying to get Conrad to introduce him to his network of wealthy investors. He cowardly traded my pain for a potential business favor. He explicitly warned Conrad that I was enraged, that I knew about the photos, and that I might try to ruin the precious Pemberton wedding. The one person I trusted outside of my toxic family stabbed me right in the back without a second of hesitation. Taught me a very harsh, unforgettable lesson that night. When money, access, and status are on the line, loyalty is meaningless. 2 days after my infuriating phone call with Griffin, a courier arrived at the front desk of my luxury apartment building. He was wearing a crisp, professional uniform and carrying a heavy, gold-embossed envelope that looked official and expensive. For a brief, stupidly naive second, a tiny part of me thought it was a late wedding invitation. I foolishly thought maybe my father had finally talked some sense into Sterling, or maybe they had a sudden, miraculous change of heart. I tipped the courier, walked into my kitchen, and ripped open the thick cream cardstock. There was no invitation inside. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of stapled legal documents. It was a manila folder containing an unhinged temporary restraining order. My father, the former Honorable Judge Conrad Ashford, had maliciously used his deep, corrupt connections in the local court system to get it signed and expedited past a sitting judge he used to personally mentor. He even had the sheer nerve to list himself as a primary witness. I read the dense legal jargon, my vision practically blurring with absolute rage. The official document claimed I was mentally unstable, harbored deep, violent, unprovoked jealousy toward my successful brother, and posed an immediate, dangerous physical threat to the wealthy wedding guests. He legally mandated that I stay at least 500 feet away from the Hamptons property on the entire day of the ceremony. He was terrified I would show up, make a public scene, and reveal to the Pembertons that his golden prince was actually living rent-free in a house bought entirely with his younger, despised son's real estate commissions. As I was standing there staring blankly at the restraining order, my phone buzzed violently on the granite kitchen counter. It was a text message from Sterling. It was short, venomous, and dripping with massive, unearned entitlement. I read it out loud to the empty room, my voice shaking. "The Pembertons strongly value blood purity and legacy," he wrote. "You are just a loud, annoying reminder of the gutter we originally came from. Stay in your lane, Everett. Don't embarrass us. And you should be grateful I even let you pay the property taxes for the last 2 years. Consider it your rent for being allowed to be part of this family." I stared at the glowing screen for what felt like an eternity. My jaw locked so tight my teeth genuinely ached. A thick blue vein throbbed painfully in my temple. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not break down and cry on the kitchen floor. The searing, burning pain of rejection evaporated almost instantly, leaving behind a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly calm rage. Sterling honestly thought I was paying those massive property taxes out of blind, pathetic brotherly devotion. He was an absolute idiot. He did not realize that by diligently paying those taxes directly from my personal bank accounts, I was intentionally building an undeniable, legally binding paper trail of sole financial responsibility over the estate. I walked slowly over to my home office desk, picked up the ridiculous restraining order, and carefully placed it in a secure file folder. That text message was his absolute biggest mistake. It was the exact moment I permanently stopped being the residual child and officially became the architect of their total, unavoidable ruin. I didn't waste another second crying over a fake family that clearly never wanted me. I didn't call a standard family lawyer to fight the ridiculous, fabricated restraining order in court. I called Quentin. Quentin is a brilliant, obsessive, relentless forensic accountant I use exclusively for my high-stakes commercial real estate deals. He is the kind of guy who can find a missing penny in a billion-dollar corporate ledger, hidden deep in an offshore account. I called him at 8 o'clock at night, told him I needed a massive personal favor, and I needed it done off the books and under the radar. I spent the next 3 consecutive nights locked inside Quentin's cramped, windowless office downtown. We were surrounded by towering stacks of empty coffee cups, greasy takeout boxes, and glowing, high-resolution monitors displaying endless, mind-numbing spreadsheets. I explicitly instructed Quentin to dig as deep as humanly possible into the family limited partnership. This was a complex legal structure my father had pressured me to sign onto years ago when I first started making real, substantial money in the market. He claimed it was a standard, responsible procedure to seamlessly protect my assets from frivolous lawsuits and build a shared, generational inheritance for the family. Because I desperately craved his basic approval back then, I foolishly signed the thick stack of documents without hiring my own independent lawyer to properly review them. Quentin cracked his knuckles, pushed his thick glasses up his nose, and started running the tax identification numbers through his secure financial databases. It took him less than 4 hours to find the massive, rotting hole right in the center of the partnership. Quentin suddenly stopped typing, spun his massive monitor around to face me, and pointed a pen at a series of terrifying, glaring red numbers on the screen. Conrad had not just been poorly managing my trust fund. He had been actively raiding it like a personal piggy bank for years. The amount of money I thought was sitting safely in a diversified investment account was gone. But that was not even the worst part. Quentin rapidly pulled up a separate, hidden file. He showed me exactly how Conrad had maliciously used a buried legal loophole in the partnership agreement. My father, the exact man supposed to protect my future, had listed me as the primary personal guarantor for 10 separate, massive high-interest loans. I felt all the blood rapidly drain from my face. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I was staring at digital copies of heavy loan documents with my perfectly forged signature plastered on them. Because of my father's actions, I was legally on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars in toxic debt I never even knew existed. The trust was supposed to be my safety net, my hard-earned inheritance for the future. Instead, it was a loaded financial weapon they used directly against me. Quentin looked at me, genuine, deep pity in his tired, bloodshot eyes. He quietly asked me if I wanted to call the police right then and press felony charges. I slowly shook my head. The police would just arrest him, he would immediately post bail, and the expensive lawyers would drag it out for years in court. That was far too easy. I wanted to dismantle his entire life exactly the way he tried to dismantle mine. We didn't stop there. I looked at Quentin and told him to keep digging until his fingers literally bled on the keyboard. We had to break through the complex layers of shell companies and fake vendor invoices Conrad had meticulously set up to hide his tracks from the IRS. By the 4th agonizing night, we finally traced the loans back to a specific, questionable loan officer named Roland. Roland was a notoriously slimy, unethical banker well known in the city's real estate underbelly for turning a blind eye to shady collateral, just as long as his personal commission fee was high enough. Conrad had actively, purposefully used my pristine, hard-earned credit score to secure these 10 separate high-interest loans through Roland, knowing I would be the one destroyed if they ever defaulted. Quentin finally cracked the encrypted expense reports and pulled them up on the main screen for me to see. I sat back in my leather chair, crossed my arms over my chest, and watched the brutal, sickening breakdown of exactly where my stolen credit was going. It was devastating to look at. There were massive, recurring monthly charges for Sterling's exclusive, invite-only country club memberships. There were endless, staggering receipts for custom-tailored Italian suits, the exact same suits he wore to mock me to my face. There were exorbitant bills for luxury car leases, including a brand new, ridiculously fast sports car for Sterling, and ridiculously expensive dinners at Michelin-star restaurants where they probably laughed about how stupid I was. Conrad had literally funded Sterling's entire fake, millionaire lifestyle using my name and my stolen future. The profound realization hit me like a physical punch to the gut. My father did not just neglect me emotionally when I was a kid. He actively, consciously tried to turn me into his permanent, silent financial safety net. He viewed me purely as a disposable workhorse. I was supposed to grind away in the dirty city, dealing with stressful clients and working grueling 80-hour weeks, while they lived like absolute kings out in the Hamptons on my dime. He truly thought he used a clever, unbreakable paper door to trap me forever. He thought because he was a former judge, I would be far too intimidated by the dense legal jargon to ever look closely at the partnership documents. He severely underestimated the man I had become. I am a master negotiator. I read the fine print for a living, and I know exactly how to exploit it. I looked over at Quentin, my voice dead calm, and told him to print every single page. Every receipt, every email, every forged signature. I was no longer just dealing with a toxic family dispute. I was actively uncovering a sophisticated financial crime syndicate that just happened to share my last name. The dark rabbit hole of my father's corruption went even deeper than I could have ever possibly imagined. 2 days later, Quentin called me at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. His voice was visibly shaking through the phone, entirely stripped of its usual calm professionalism. He told me to get in my car and drive to his office immediately, no matter what. When I walked through his heavy glass door, he had a massive, fresh stack of documents printed out and spread chaotically across his large conference table. He looked at me, his eyes wide with shock. This was infinitely worse than the credit card fraud and the stolen trust fund. Quentin had spent the last 48 continuous hours tracing the exact origin of the hard money lenders that Roland the banker was using. Conrad was not just a desperate, pathetic father secretly borrowing money to spoil his entitled favorite child. He was a deeply corrupt former official. Quentin had successfully found a meticulously hidden trail of consulting fees paid directly into a secure offshore account controlled solely by Conrad. The payments came from the exact same predatory lenders he used to trap me. It was a classic, blatant, illegal kickback scheme. I had seen bitter divorce cases in his courtroom when I was younger, really ugly, contested custody battles where people destroyed each other with vicious lies, but nothing prepared me for my own father's massive betrayal. Conrad was actively, intentionally steering vulnerable clients from his old legal practice directly to these predatory lenders, and in return he got a massive cut of the dirty profits. He was a judge who had sworn a sacred oath to uphold the law, but he had forgotten that every single paper trail eventually has an end. I have seen nasty legal battles before in commercial real estate. I have seen intense corporate espionage and ruthless boardroom backstabbing that would make your head spin. But seeing my own father's systematic, cold-blooded corruption laid out clearly on a bright Excel spreadsheet broke something inside me forever. The last tiny, fraying thread of respect I had for the man snapped instantly. I gathered the heavy files, placing them carefully into a thick, secure leather binder. I did not call the local police department. Local cops are way too slow, and Conrad still had powerful, corrupt friends in the precinct who would undoubtedly tip him off. Instead, I reached out to a trusted, effective contact I had made during a massive federal real estate deal a few years ago. Special Agent Reed Norcross with the FBI. We met in a quiet, discreet diner on the edge of the city. I slid the perfectly organized, color-coded binder of my father's federal crimes across the table to him. I told Agent Norcross I was handing him a massive, career-making case on a silver platter, but I desperately needed a few weeks of absolute radio silence before they moved in. I had a massive Hamptons wedding to ruin first. Agent Norcross explained that the evidence still had to be authenticated, subpoenas issued, and a federal warrant approved. While the investigation moved through those required steps, I focused on the property I legally owned. I finalized a massive real estate deal I had been quietly, meticulously nurturing in the background for over a month and a half. I owned the Hamptons house outright. I paid the heavy mortgage every month, I paid the exorbitant taxes. My name was the only one on the official deed. I didn't just casually list the glass house on the public real estate market. That would take way too long, and Conrad might easily find out and try to tie the property up in endless, frivolous litigation using his old judge buddies to stall the sale. Instead, I bypassed the public market entirely. I entered into a high-stakes, private, ironclad escrow with a major film production company based out of Los Angeles. They were scouting locations for a massive $100 million blockbuster action movie. They desperately needed a modern, sterile, wealthy-looking location to serve as the main villain's lair. My cold, empty, $2.5 million glass house in the Hamptons was perfect for their grand vision. They were desperate to start shooting, so they eagerly offered me 20% over the already high asking price if I could guarantee immediate, unhindered access to the property for their massive crew. I agreed to their inflated price without hesitation, but I sat down with their aggressive legal team and added one very specific, non-negotiable legal rider to the thick contract. I called it a delayed possession clause. The closing officially recorded on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The life-changing wire transfer hit my secure, offshore accounts, safely away from Conrad's corrupt reach. But the legal right to actually physically occupy the property was explicitly set to transition at a very specific, carefully calculated date and exact time. I timed it with absolute surgical precision. The complete transition of legal power and ownership was bound by strict law to occur at exactly 12 noon on Saturday. That was the exact, precise moment Sterling and his wealthy bride, Celeste Pemberton, were scheduled to stand in the dead center of the living room and exchange their sacred vows in front of 200 elite guests. I signed the final, heavy paperwork, shook the lead producer's hand firmly, and walked out of the towering glass office building feeling invincible. The trap was officially set. It was no longer an emotional, messy family dispute. It was an ironclad, legally binding contract backed by the state, and I was the only one holding the key. To make sure there were no hidden loopholes, no last-minute, desperate escapes for Sterling or Conrad, I needed the precise minute-by-minute details of the entire wedding day. I needed to know exactly how many people would be standing in that glass house when the clock struck exactly noon. I got lucky. Camille Redmond, the high-end wedding planner Sterling had hired to impress the Pembertons, was overworked. Because I remained the owner of record and had once been listed as the property contact, her assistant mistakenly copied me on the unredacted master itinerary for the weekend. I opened the spreadsheet on my computer and smiled a very cold smile. 250 elite guests, a massive, 50-person catering crew, full valet parking blocking the entire narrow residential street, unpermitted, massive champagne tent set up right in the backyard. In the Hamptons, local zoning ordinances are strict and unforgiving. You cannot just throw a massive, loud commercial event in a quiet residential zone without pulling expensive permits, passing rigorous safety inspections, and arranging off-site shuttle logistics. Sterling, blinded by his own massive arrogance and trying to secretly save a few bucks for his luxurious honeymoon, had ignored all of that. I quickly drafted a detailed, specific anonymous tip. I attached Camille's official itinerary, complete with exact headcounts and massive vendor lists, as undeniable proof. I sent it directly to the Township Zoning Board, the local fire marshal, and the chief of police. I informed them in great detail that an unlicensed, high-capacity commercial gathering posing a massive, immediate fire hazard was currently taking place at my private residential address without my legal consent. In that specific, wealthy zip code, violating zoning laws for an event of that sheer size carries an immediate, non-negotiable fine of $10,000 per hour. I closed my laptop, the screen going black. I had successfully weaponized the rigid law, the massive real estate market, and the entire local government directly against them. There was no way out for them now. The walls were rapidly, silently closing in, and they were far too busy picking out expensive silk napkins to even notice the trap. Saturday morning finally arrived. The bright sun was beating down intensely on the Hamptons, turning the massive glass house I legally bought into a literal glowing, hot diamond against the perfectly manicured green landscape. Meanwhile, I was sitting miles away at the cold granite kitchen island in my quiet city apartment. I slowly poured myself a fresh cup of strong black coffee. The apartment was silent, a stark, profound contrast to the absolute circus I knew was currently unfolding at the Hamptons property. My phone buzzed and loudly on the counter. It was one last, arrogant text message from Sterling. It was a high-resolution, perfectly lit photo of him standing right in the grand foyer, the exact spot where he had cruelly uninvited me just a few weeks prior. He was wearing an expensive, custom white designer tuxedo that probably cost more than my very first car. His hair was perfectly slicked back, not a single strand remotely out of place. He had a smug, victorious grin plastered across his punchable face. The caption underneath the photo was a final, unnecessary twist of the knife. It read, "Today I finally have the incredible life I truly deserve. I am officially marrying into royalty. Stay in your sad little city apartment, Everett. You are not and never will be one of us." I stared blankly at the insulting photo. I did not reply to it. I did not feel a single ounce of anger, sadness, or regret. I just felt a profound, heavy sense of absolute anticipation. I set the phone face down slowly on the cold granite counter. I opened my laptop. A message from the film company's location manager confirmed that the sheriff's deputy and the production trucks had turned onto Maple Rest Drive and were approaching the glass house. I took another very slow sip. The massive, inescapable trap I had meticulously built over the last grueling month was no longer just an idea on paper. It was a cold, heavy steel vice, and the gears were finally, inevitably turning. The glowing digital clock on my computer screen loudly clicked to exactly 11:59 a.m. I quickly opened a second tab on my secure browser. It was the Savant Master Administrative Portal for the $1 million smart home system I had personally installed in the Hamptons property when I bought it. Since my name was the only one on the legal deed, I had supreme, unoverridable administrative control over every single wire, electronic lock, and water pipe in that entire building. I confidently clicked on the interior security camera feed. The massive, open-concept living room was packed shoulder to shoulder with wealthy people in expensive silk dresses and perfectly tailored linen suits. They were all silent, holding their breath in the overwhelming presence of fake Hamptons royalty. Sterling was standing proudly at the expensive floral altar, tightly holding Celeste Pemberton's hands. The bright sunlight poured intensely through the massive glass walls, illuminating them perfectly for the expensive photographers. He was mid-sentence, looking deeply into her eyes with a practiced, fake sincerity, promising her a life of unwavering stability, immense wealth, and endless luxury. The digital clock on my bright screen finally struck exactly 12 noon. I moved the mouse, took a deep breath, and activated the scheduled transfer protocol agreed to with the new owner. Local control of the smart home system shifted to the production company, and the property entered maintenance mode. First, the main water supply shifted into maintenance mode. Then the local wall controls went dark, preventing Sterling from overriding the new owner's settings. The emergency privacy tint moved across the glass walls until the bright ceremony room became dim and enclosed. The doors remained operable from inside, as required by the fire code, but the sudden change still sent a nervous murmur through the guests. Sterling stopped speaking mid-sentence and rushed to the wall panel. He pressed every button he could find, but nothing responded. For the first time, he looked powerless inside the house he had falsely claimed to own. Confusion spread through the room. Guests whispered, shifted in their seats, and looked toward the exits. A maintenance alarm sounded through the ceiling speakers, followed by a calm, automated notice that legal possession of the property had changed and all occupants should prepare to leave. Red indicator lights blinked along the walls. I zoomed in on Sterling's face. His practiced confidence vanished as he pounded on the disabled control panel, unable to command a house that had never belonged to him. The heavy silence inside the darkened glass house was suddenly broken by the loud, aggressive crunching of gravel outside. From my computer screen in the city, I watched the exterior security feed with absolute focus. 3 massive, bright white production trucks emblazoned with the Sin City Productions logo backed into the long, circular driveway. They blocked the expensive valet parking lane. Right behind them, a fully marked local sheriff's cruiser pulled up, its heavy tires tearing up the perfectly manicured green lawn. The red and blue police lights began violently flashing against the blacked-out glass walls of the house. Inside, the terrified wedding guests could see the bright police lights strobing through the thick privacy tint. The sheer panic in the living room escalated instantly. A tall, broad-shouldered sheriff's deputy stepped out of his cruiser and approached the front entrance with the film company's attorney. Because the interior exit hardware remained active, a member of the catering staff opened the door from inside. The deputy entered, raised his flashlight toward the dim room, and asked everyone to remain calm. He ignored the flowers, the designer suits, and the stunned expressions. His attention settled on Sterling. Sterling was still striking the dead wall panel, his white tuxedo damp with sweat. The deputy walked directly to him and handed him a formal notice. Weeks earlier, the production company had served notice that Sterling's revocable license to occupy the property would end at 12 noon on the wedding day. That deadline had now passed, and legal possession belonged to the new corporate owner. Sterling looked down at the notice, and the arrogance drained from his face. He tried to insist that he owned the property, but the deputy calmly stated that the deed, sale documents, and prior notice had all been verified. The production company was waiting outside and required immediate access to begin its contracted work. Sterling stammered and looked toward Celeste Pemberton, who stared back in horror. The deputy told him that the gathering had to end and that anyone who refused a lawful order to leave after receiving notice could be cited or arrested for trespass. Guests were free to exit safely through the front and side doors. The ceremony was over. The heavy silence that immediately followed the deputy's strict announcement was honestly the most beautiful, satisfying thing I have ever heard in my entire life. I sat in my quiet apartment, zoomed the security camera in on my father. Conrad was leaning against a structural support pillar, his entire face drained of color. His right hand was trembling. He slowly turned his head and realized the wealthy Pemberton matriarch was already standing up from her front row seat. She was clutching her expensive pearls, ignoring the flashing red emergency lights, and looking directly at Conrad like he was a disgusting cockroach she had just found in her expensive kitchen. Thaddeus Pemberton, the powerful, intimidating billionaire father of the bride, stepped forward. He did not look scared. He looked furious. He marched directly up to Sterling, ignoring the sheriff's deputy standing right next to them. Thaddeus snatched the official eviction notice right out of Sterling's trembling hands. He pulled his reading glasses from his expensive suit pocket, shoved them onto his face, and rapidly read the legal document. I watched Thaddeus's face turn purple with absolute rage. He crumpled the legal paper in his massive fist and threw it directly at Sterling's chest. "You lied to us?" Thaddeus Pemberton roared, his deep voice easily overpowering the wailing smart home sirens. "You sat right at my expensive dining table, you drank my wine, and you bragged about buying this massive estate with your own money. You told my daughter you were a successful real estate developer. This legal document clearly says you are nothing but a pathetic squatter. You don't own a single inch of this property." Sterling desperately fell to his knees, his expensive white tuxedo pants hitting the hard marble floor. He reached out and tried to grab Thaddeus's suit jacket, desperately begging him to listen, claiming it was just a massive misunderstanding, a terrible mistake made by his jealous younger brother. But Thaddeus sharply kicked Sterling's hands away. He looked down at my brother with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Then, Thaddeus turned to his shocked daughter. Celeste was crying, her expensive mascara running down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She looked at Sterling kneeling on the floor, and the look of sheer embarrassment on her face was undeniable. She pulled the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger, threw it directly at Sterling's face, and turned her back on him completely. Thaddeus Pemberton raised his voice and addressed the entire dark room. "This wedding is canceled," he yelled. "Everyone get out of this house right now. Do not speak to these incredible frauds. Do not give them a single second of your time." The 250 wealthy guests immediately scrambled toward the front doors, abandoning the expensive champagne and the massive floral arrangements. They practically trampled over each other to escape the flashing red lights and the wailing sirens. I watched Sterling sobbing on the floor, abandoned by his wealthy bride, rejected by the elite society he desperately sacrificed me to join. His entire fake, fabricated life disintegrated into absolute dust in a matter of seconds. While the chaotic, humiliating mass exodus was happening inside the grand foyer, things were getting significantly worse outside on the massive front lawn. I actively switched my computer screen to the exterior driveway cameras. The local township zoning inspector had just arrived, pulling up in a marked municipal vehicle. He slammed his car door shut, carrying a thick, heavy clipboard loaded with official citations. He ignored the fleeing, wealthy wedding guests in their expensive suits and dresses. He marched directly up to my father, Conrad, who was desperately trying to sneak out the back door to avoid the incredible humiliation. The inspector blocked Conrad's path entirely. He shoved a heavy pen and a thick stack of yellow citation papers directly into Conrad's chest. Because Conrad had legally signed the permits for the massive catering tents under his own name to hide Sterling's lack of credit, he was the one officially responsible for the incredible mess. The inspector loudly cited him for operating an illegal, dangerous commercial venue in a strictly residential zone. He cited him for extreme fire code violations, illegal parking logistics that blocked the main road, and creating a public nuisance. I turned the volume up on my computer speakers. I could distinctly hear the inspector's loud, aggressive voice over the chaotic noise of the fleeing guests. Former Judge Conrad Ashford, the inspector yelled, refusing to use my father's outdated honorable title. You are currently being fined exactly $10,000 for the first hour of this illegal event. Since the massive catering tents and the heavy equipment will take at least 2 full days to dismantle and remove from this property, you are looking at a minimum penalty of well over $200,000 in direct municipal fines. You have exactly 14 days to pay the township in full, or we will place a heavy lien on every single asset you currently own. Conrad physically staggered backward like he had just been violently punched in the stomach. He clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing like a dying fish. He tried to use his old, corrupt intimidation tactics. He pointed his finger at the inspector and threatened to call the mayor, desperately claiming he had powerful friends in the local government who would crush this citation. But the inspector just laughed right in his face. He told Conrad that the mayor was actually the one who personally dispatched him after receiving a detailed anonymous tip. Conrad was trapped. He was standing on the front lawn of a house he did not own, surrounded by angry police officers, facing absolute financial ruin. I sat back in my comfortable chair in my quiet city apartment. I watched Sterling being physically escorted off the property by 2 sheriff's deputies because he refused to stop screaming at the film crew. I watched the heavy production trucks roll right onto the expensive lawn, crushing the white wedding flowers under their massive tires. The stressful, toxic weight I had carried on my shoulders for 17 long years was gone. I slowly reached out, closed my laptop, and listened to the silence of my apartment. The incredible storm was finally over. I had won completely. 2 chaotic, satisfying weeks later, the thick dust in the Hamptons had finally settled, but the wreckage of my toxic family was still smoldering. Sterling did not get his massive Pemberton dowry or his coveted elite social status. Instead, he got a mountain of crushing debt and a personal reputation that was radioactive in every single wealthy zip code from Manhattan to Montauk. The powerful Pemberton lawyers did not just easily annul the fake marriage. They sued Sterling in civil court for extreme fraudulent inducement and emotional distress. They froze his very few remaining bank accounts. Because of the massive, aggressive lawsuit and the absolute lack of any actual income, Sterling was violently evicted from his expensive luxury apartment in the city. He could not run to Conrad for money because Conrad's accounts were drained by the massive municipal fines. So, the former Golden Prince of the Hamptons was currently living in a cramped, 400-square-foot studio apartment situated directly above a noisy, smelly commercial bakery in the worst part of town. He had nothing left to his name but a bruised, shattered ego and that old, rusted vintage Porsche he stole from me years ago. And honestly, I was already in the aggressive legal process of forcefully repossessing that exact car through the family limited partnership dissolution. Sterling was currently working 2 exhausting, minimum-wage graveyard shifts just to pay off a $300,000 settlement to the angry wedding vendors he stiffed. As for me, I officially moved out of the loud city. I used a small portion of the massive film production money to purchase a modest, quiet 2-bedroom wooden cottage with a bright red door. It had a massive porch with a beautiful, unobstructed view of the deep woods. No glass walls. No fake neighbors. Just absolute, pure peace. I was sitting on my front porch on a quiet Tuesday morning, drinking a warm cup of coffee, when a familiar, depressing black sedan slowly pulled into my long gravel driveway. The car engine sputtered before shutting off. My father, Conrad, slowly stepped out of the vehicle. He looked old, exhausted, and physically much smaller than I remembered him. The arrogant, terrifyingly honorable judge had lost his massive stature along with his contested judicial pension. He clutched a worn leather briefcase tightly against his chest like a pathetic, battered shield. He slowly walked up my wooden front steps. He did not lead the conversation with a genuine apology. He did not ask how I was doing. He led with a desperate, pathetic plea. Conrad stood awkwardly on my front porch, his expensive shoes covered in the cheap dirt of my driveway. He desperately tried to force a warm, fatherly smile, but his face just looked hollow and broken. He quickly opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally binding release of liability form and a cheap plastic pen. His right hand was shaking violently as he forcefully pushed the paper directly toward me across the small porch table. He cleared his throat and told me he had a minor, innocent misunderstanding with the hard money lenders. He lied directly to my face, claiming the family limited partnership was entirely facing a catastrophic, unfair federal audit. He desperately told me that, for the absolute sake of our proud family legacy, I urgently needed to sign the liability release right now. He claimed it would safely protect both of us from the aggressive government agents. He actively tried to manipulate my emotions. He brought up my deceased mother, claiming that for the absolute sake of her precious memory, I desperately needed to step up and finally act like a loyal son. He forcefully promised we could instantly go back to the exact way things were before the messy wedding incident. He even disgustingly called me sweetheart, for the first time in over a decade. It was the predictable, pathetic false ending I had been expecting. It was a final, desperate attempt to weaponize my childhood guilt and use it as a legally binding signature to save his own corrupt skin. I did not take the cheap plastic pen. I did not even bother looking at the legal paper. I just casually took another slow sip of my hot coffee and stared directly into his panicked, deceptive eyes. "You misunderstand your current situation, Conrad," I said, my voice flat, devoid of any familial warmth. "There is no family legacy left to protect. You actively sold it to predatory lenders to fund Sterling's pathetic country club memberships. And you lost the absolute right to ever speak my mother's name the exact day you handed her precious car keys to your golden child while I stood freezing in the rain." Conrad's face hardened into absolute anger. The fake, desperate fatherly mask slipped, revealing the toxic, deeply corrupt monster underneath. He slammed his fist violently onto the wooden table, rattling my coffee mug. He raised his voice, desperately trying to intimidate me using his old courtroom tactics. He loudly told me I was making a massive, unforgivable mistake. He threatened to drag my entire professional reputation through the mud in open court if I refused to quickly sign the document. He thought he could still control me with heavy threats and loud anger. But he was wrong. He did not realize I had a powerful guest waiting quietly inside my house. Before Conrad could shout another toxic threat, the heavy wooden front door of my cottage slowly opened behind me. Conrad froze, his mouth hanging wide open in absolute shock. My godfather, Malcolm, and stern, respected retired military officer, slowly stepped out onto the bright porch. Malcolm was my deceased mother's oldest, most trusted friend, and the only person in the world who truly knew how miserable she was in her toxic marriage. Malcolm did not look at me. He looked Conrad dead in the eye with a level of absolute, unfiltered hatred that made the cold morning air feel even colder. Malcolm reached into his heavy coat pocket and pulled out a yellowed, fragile handwritten letter. It was carefully sealed inside a protective plastic sleeve. He shoved the old letter directly into Conrad's trembling chest, practically forcing him to take it. Conrad looked down at the familiar handwriting, and his entire face turned the color of dead ash. It was a secret letter my mother, Marianne, had secretly written in her final, painful days in the hospital. She had explicitly addressed it to Malcolm, detailing exactly how she feared Conrad would eventually violently drain my entire future just to feed Sterling's massive vanity. Malcolm stood tall, his voice hitting the porch like heavy iron. I explicitly promised Marianne I would violently protect her youngest son from you, Conrad, Malcolm said, pointing a thick finger directly at my father's face. She explicitly knew exactly what kind of corrupt, toxic parasite you truly were. She begged me to hold onto this exact letter until the exact day Everett finally realized the brutal truth for himself. Today, my long job is finally done. Conrad's face collapsed into horror as he read his deceased wife's final, damning indictment of his entire character. He violently realized his entire narrative of being a loving, grieving widower was destroyed. The massive guilt trip he desperately tried to use on me evaporated into thin air. He looked desperately at me, his mouth rapidly opening and closing to desperately spin one last, pathetic lie. He tried to claim the old letter was fake, a massive forgery violently designed to unfairly tear the family apart. But I immediately cut him off before he could violently poison the air any further. I slowly stood up from my comfortable porch chair, looking down at the pathetic, defeated man who used to terrify me. I am not signing your ridiculous release form, Conrad, I said loudly, my voice echoing sharply off the quiet trees surrounding my property. And you are not going to walk back to your depressing car and easily drive away from this mess, because you failed to notice something important when you violently pulled into my driveway this morning. Conrad looked confused, his eyes darting around the empty driveway. I pointed my finger directly at the slightly open window of my kitchen, located just 10 feet away from where we were standing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been occupying my kitchen for the last 20 solid minutes, I announced. The heavy front door fully opened again. Special Agent Reed Norcross confidently stepped out onto the porch, carrying a fresh cup of my coffee in his right hand. He was wearing an official dark blue FBI windbreaker. He casually flashed his gold badge directly in Conrad's terrified face. Carter smiled, lacking any actual warmth. We have been actively listening to every single desperate word of your illegal attempted coercion through that open window, Conrad, Agent Norcross said, his voice professional. We also have the undeniable audio recording of you threatening to destroy a key federal witness. I did not feel a single ounce of joy or twisted celebration as 2 additional armed federal agents stepped around the side of the house and onto the porch to violently escort my father away. I just felt a profound, heavy silence wash over my entire body. I stood still and watched the corrupt man who raised me be pushed against the side of the black sedan. I listened to the loud, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists. I finally realized the absolute irony of the entire situation. Conrad had spent 30 long years actively manipulating justice, crushing vulnerable people in his corrupt courtroom, and stealing from his own son to maintain a fake social status. Yet, he was ultimately destroyed entirely by the one specific person he actively thought was entirely too residual, too weak to ever fight back. Agent Norcross patted my shoulder, thanked me loudly for my incredible cooperation, and shoved Conrad into the back of the federal vehicle. I turned around, walked into my quiet house, and locked the heavy front door behind me. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't just have an expensive roof over my head. I finally had absolute, unbreakable peace. The heavy, complex legal fallout over the next several months was surgical and devastating. An aggressive grand jury situated in the Eastern District of New York rapidly handed down a massive, undeniable federal indictment against Conrad. They charged him with 10 separate counts of extreme wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and severe, publicized judicial misconduct. The aggressive federal prosecutors used the binder of financial evidence I provided to destroy any pathetic defense his expensive lawyers tried to mount. The federal court eventually ordered an unavoidable financial restitution of exactly $482,000. It accounted for every single stolen penny he had siphoned through the corrupt family limited partnership to illegally fund Sterling's fake lifestyle. Conrad was officially sentenced to 5 hard years in a federal correctional institution. He was stripped of his entire legal license, and the government revoked his massive judicial pension with no possibility of ever reclaiming it. He went from being a respected judge to a disgraced federal inmate in a matter of months. A few quiet months ago, a heavy, cheap paper envelope arrived in my mailbox. It had an official, heavy red stamp from the federal prison system on the front. It was directly from Conrad. I opened it slowly. He wrote about the deep importance of family blood. He actively complained about the terrible prison food and accused me of unfairly punishing him for a simple, misunderstood mistake. He even desperately tried to violently guilt-trip me one last time by saying my deceased mother would not want me to be so cold and unforgiving toward my own father. I read the pathetic letter standing entirely in my quiet, sunlit kitchen. I did not get angry. My heart did not race. I didn't even feel the slightest urge to grab a pen and write back a scathing, hateful retort. I just felt nothing but absolute, entirely pure indifference. I slowly walked across the warm wooden floor to my small home office. I dropped the toxic envelope directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder. I stood there, drinking a fresh glass of water, and quietly listened to the satisfying, mechanical hum of the sharp steel blades destroying the last heavy piece of my toxic past. I learned a valuable lesson that morning. Absolute indifference is a much more powerful, entirely unbreakable shield than massive, exhausting rage. My entirely new life looks different now. My true family does not share my given last name, and they certainly do not care about my massive bank account. My true family is my godfather Malcolm, who actively drives out to check in on me every single Sunday morning with fresh coffee. It is my kind neighbor down the quiet dirt road who constantly brings over fresh, delicious extra sourdough bread just because she baked too much. My family is the motivated group of young, smart young men and women I actively mentor through the massive financial literacy foundation I entirely started in my deceased mother's honor. We actively help these vulnerable young people navigate the confusing, dangerous world of heavy legal contracts, toxic debt traps, and total financial independence. We teach them how to fiercely protect themselves so they never have to be a residual, disposable child exactly like I was. When I walk outside onto my quiet porch now, my shoulders do not feel heavy anymore. The crisp, clean air surrounding this quiet wooden house feels light and entirely breathable. I took my entire life back from the absolute toxic vultures who violently tried to steal it. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my entire story. I hope this personal experience resonated with you in some truly meaningful way. Have you ever found yourself trapped in a similar situation, actively dealing with toxic, manipulative family members who only want to use you? I want to encourage you to fiercely protect your own peace. Remember, absolute blood does not make you a true family. Complete, unbreakable loyalty and mutual respect do. You are entirely allowed to walk away from toxic people who constantly hurt you, even if you share their DNA. If you made it to the absolute end of this long video, you are truly amazing. Please drop a W in the comments section below. That W stands for winner. It is our secret sign for the 1% Club, the amazing group of people who fiercely push through to the absolute finish line with me. Please take a quick second to hit that like button and actively follow the channel so we can share more incredible, emotional stories together in the future. Stay strong, fiercely protect your massive boundaries, and never let anyone tell you that you do not entirely deserve a seat at the table you built.